This is George Lucas, and I'm the writer-director of Star Wars. I made this film a long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
And I'm Ben Burtt, creator of robot and creature voices.
And this is Carrie Fisher.
And I'm Dennis Murin, visual effects supervisor on Star Wars. And on the original Star Wars here, I was credited as second cameraman.
When I first made the film, the studio was adamant that I not put Episode 4, New Hope, on it, because they said people would be completely confused by it, since there is no other Star Wars films. And so when it was originally released in the theaters, that part of it wasn't there. It wasn't until after the film became a big hit that I was able to put it back on. So by the time I got to the VHS and all of the subsequent chapters, all had their chapter headings.
The original opening crawl we did was letters that were cut out of black paper and the camera moving over them very, very slowly. I think they were probably about 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. Back before about 1990, almost everything was done with physical models. We'd build models and set them up in front of the camera, put lights on them, and we had a computer-controlled camera that would move around with motors that we programmed and that ran at a very, very slow speed, but it allowed some pretty fast motions when you play the film back at normal speed. And this crawl took forever for us to shoot the original version of it. It probably took like 3 hours. We had to shoot 2 or 3 different versions of it. And there was also a lot of different language versions of it and all.
I started writing the film. I originally intended it to be one episode of a Saturday matinee serial that used to play in movie theaters. You used to go to the movie theaters, and every Saturday they'd have a new episode of a particular story that would go on for a while, and then you did end in a cliffhanger, and then you'd come back the next week and see it again. It's sort of like what television is today. So when I started writing, the script got bigger and bigger and bigger and longer and longer and longer. I worked on the script for about 2 years, doing a lot of research on mythology and mythological motifs and that sort of thing. And then when I finished it, I realized I had almost a 200-page script. So I knew I couldn't make that into a movie. It was just too big and too complicated and way too long. But rather than cut it down, what I decided to do was simply take the first act of the film and make a movie out of that. But at the same time that I put the rest of the movie on the shelf to start working on this episode, I swore to myself that all that other work that I'd done for a year wasn't going to go to waste, and I would eventually finish the whole story. Because the first part of the story doesn't really have much to it. It's just an introduction of characters. Originally, it didn't even have the Death Star. The Death Star was actually at the end of the big script. But I felt I really needed to have that climax, so I pushed it into this film. But the overall arcing story of Darth Vader and the relationship of Darth Vader to Luke and all that sort of thing was too much to try to get into one movie.
George Lucas wanted what he called an organic soundtrack. That is, he wanted the sounds in the film to sound natural. He wasn't interested in perhaps what was the tradition in previous science fiction films, which was to generate electronic sounds and synthesized sounds that would have an otherworldly quality. He wanted the sounds to have a worldly quality, that they would sound like real objects, real motors, actual places. The doors would be rusty on the spaceships or the places where people lived. The engines would sound like that they were maybe mistuned or would backfire once in a while. He wanted a used universe, in a sense. And so by sending me out to record actual acoustic sounds in the everyday world, he was asking me to really gather natural sound which would make this world of fantasy things seem credible and natural.
R2-D2, where are you?
I thought I was doing a little cool movie. I didn't really want to be an actress, but I read the script with a friend of mine who is an actor, Miguel Ferrer, and we read it out loud, and we both wanted to play Han Solo. We read it out loud and thought, how is he going to do this? How is he going to make it look like what it says? Because it was all there in the script, and we read it out loud and thought, nobody's ever done this before. Not that I was in the habit of reading scripts out loud, but this begged to be kind of read out loud. And I couldn't be Han Solo, so the one part I could be was Princess Leia.
One of the things about casting this movie was that in Princess Leia, I was looking for somebody who was young, 19, same age as what Luke was supposed to be. But instead of being kind of a idealistic, naive farm boy from the far reaches of the Netherlands, she's like a very sophisticated, urbanized ruler, a senator. So she's a politician, she's accomplished, she's graduated, got her PhD, 19, and she rules people and is in charge. So to find an actress who could be young, but still play with a lot of authority, especially up against the cynical Han Solo, and make it believable that she could push these guys around, was a challenge. I was very lucky to find Carrie, who is very talented, but also, very sure of herself and very strong in the way she presents herself, and very sophisticated, worldly. It made that character work.
I'm going to regret this.
My original inspiration on this film was really to use mythological motifs to create a whole new kind of myth that was very updated and contemporary. So I used the Saturday matinee serial as my vessel to put this barrel of mythological motifs together. When I originally wrote the screenplay for this episode, it was very much like it is now, which is that the story starts with Princess Leia and Darth Vader and sets up the premise of the movie, which is their stolen plans to a Death Star. But once we get past that little piece of exposition, we follow the two most insignificant characters, which are the droids. And this was an idea that I was enamored with that was used by Akira Kurosawa in the film Hidden Fortress, where you take the least important characters and you follow their story in amongst this gigantic intergalactic drama that's going on around them that they don't understand. And I really wanted to have the film be led by the droids. And when some friends of mine read the screenplay, they were adamant that I not do that. They thought my first film, THX, was a little too esoteric, and they thought making a film where in the first 20 minutes you're dealing primarily with just the droids would not work. But I love the idea, and even though I shot those sequences, which were about Luke and setting up Luke at the very beginning of the movie and that sort of thing, I never liked it, and I never wanted it in the movie, so I basically kept it the way I originally wrote it. The first cut of the film had the intercuts of Luke on the planet with what was going on in space, but it just wasn't the movie I wanted to make. I mean, I wanted to make it about this kind of odd couple and tell the story from their point of view. And the film was kind of shot from their point of view, so I was sort of amused by that. At the time, it was a very bold idea, again, to have the first half hour be mainly about robots. The only real human character in the first 20 minutes of the movie is Princess Leia.
I've got to rest before I fall apart. My joints are almost frozen.
My introduction to Kurosawa's films were very powerful because it happened in film school, and I knew very little about Japanese history at that point. And when I would get thrown into something like Seven Samurai or Jimbo or Ikuro or any of the movies, it was like I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I could follow the human story, but the culture was completely complex and oblique. And I liked that. I liked that feeling of being thrown into an environment, trying to get my bearings and still be able to tell a story in that environment that made sense, that you weren't so confused that you just couldn't follow it. And in terms of fantasy films and everything, I can't stand it when you sit around and try to explain how a teleporter works or why. It's just not what the movie needs to be about.
No more adventures. I'm not going that way.
We started shooting the picture out here in Tunisia. It was extremely cold, sandstorms, raining. It was a real mess. They were blowing over our sets all the time. R2 didn't work. 3PO didn't work. We had a very hard time shooting the film. We shot for 10 days, and by the time I came back, I'd gotten about half of what I wanted to get in the desert. And I thought the film was in trouble. I wasn't going to be able to get it all together because I was, instead of staying and shooting the extra week that I probably needed, it was important that we not go over schedule in the very first 2 weeks of the movie. The studio was panicked enough about, the budget and schedule and everything.
I'm saved. Over here! Hey! Hey! Help! Please help!
I shot the best I could, and then I figured, well, I'll come back later and pick up what I need. This whole sequence with R2 in the canyon was done later in Death Valley, because I couldn't shoot that at the time. He wouldn't travel in Tunisia more than 4 or 5 feet, and even then he hardly ever went in a straight line. So it was very hard to shoot, and mostly I just threw my hands up and said, I'll figure this out later. So after the film was finished, Alan Ladd Jr. gave me the extra money I needed to go to shoot 2 weeks of second unit. And that's where most of the part where R2, the Jawas, the sand speeders, and some of the Tusken Raiders. A lot of this desert stuff actually was what I did in pickups.
The voice of R2-D2 turned out to be the most prolonged and difficult sound to develop because it involved a performance, and it also had no precedent. There hadn't been a film before which had a main character that didn't speak English and didn't have a moving mouth. R2 was described in the script as beeping and buzzing and whistling. The script did not prescribe the specific lines of dialogue that he had, but merely said that R2 responded or R2 beeped or something of that sort. And it was left up to me to try to come up with possibilities for George Lucas to listen to. George at one point thought that perhaps even recording babies before they could talk, the sounds that babies make, cooing and sighing and little vocalizations they make as they learn to talk, might be the key to R2's voice. And it was definitely the right direction to go because R2 is, kind of an ornery child. He's smart, but he's also has a certain innocence about him. He can be insubordinate, but overall he's lovable. And as the film was being developed and being cut in the editing room, I would try out different R2 voices and then get an assessment from George as to what he thought. And time again, he wasn't satisfied with what I was doing and that we really needed the voice to have more character to it. One day when George and I were discussing the voice, and we both found ourselves imitating, making little funny noises as we kind of described what R2 might be like. And it dawned on us that, maybe the very noises that we were making, the little cute vocalizations that we were using as kind of a means of symbolically manufacturing R2's voice, maybe that would lead us in the right direction. But in the end, it turned out the most efficient thing to do was for me to just perform the sounds myself. And since R2 was a machine, I still use the synthesizer to produce the electronic part of R2's voice, and then I use my own voice, making little baby sounds to produce the more human, lifelike quality of his voice. Once I combined my voice with the synthesizer, I would often take the sounds of R2 out into the real world and play them over a speaker in a room, in a hallway, in a bathroom, and re-record the lines such that they actually were recorded not in a studio. They actually had the quality of being in a real place. And that was key to getting a lot of the sounds to blend in and seem natural as if they were really done on the set. The key being to process what we call worldizing the voices, that is taking the sounds and playing them back and re-recording them in real places where you get a sense of the reflections of sound in the environment.
The main driving force in the movie is really R2-D2. He's what you say in the movie business, the MacGuffin, which is the object of everybody's search. The thing that everybody's always looking for in a movie that drives the plot along and makes it work. Definitely the film started off on a very grim foot of disaster. The storms were so bad they blew over our set of the Sandcrawler. I mean, completely demolished. There wasn't anything there the next day when we came out to the set. Yeah, with a huge amount of effort on the part of the construction crew, they were able to rebuild it in about 48 hours, working 24 hours a day.
You think they'll melt us down?
I remember this scene right here was the first scene that 3PO appeared, and we spent most of the day trying to get him into his outfit. R2 could hardly move at all. We had the remote control robot and what we called the Kenny robot. The Kenny robot was the robot with a little person inside named Kenny. And I used that because I wanted R2 to have a personality and a human reaction to things and human movements. And you can really tell the difference. Here's the remote control one in that particular scene where he is in his three-legged position and comes up with 3PO. But in almost all the other scenes here, we're using the two-legged version, which means he's standing upright. And Kenny is in the droid.
Yeah, all right, fine. Let's go.
Luke, tell your uncle if he gets a translator, be sure it speaks Bocce.
Doesn't look like we have much of a choice, but I'll remind you.
The scenes at the homestead, the rain in the storm and everything, had made the dried lake bed that we were working on very wet and muddy. And so a lot of the trucks got stuck in the mud. And then we got the Tunisian army to help with their giant tank tow trucks, try to pull out some of the trucks, and they got stuck. And then they got some big tracked vehicles, and they got stuck. And so everything sat there for about 2 weeks while the lake dried out. But it was under very difficult conditions that this Tunisian part of the film was shot. And as I say, when I got back to London, it was a pretty grim situation where I only had about half of what I was supposed to have actually shot. I wasn't over scheduled, but I didn't have the movie.
Yeah, all right, shut up. I'll take this.
Shut up, sir.
Luke! Take these two over to the garage, will you? I want them cleaned up before dinner.
I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
You can waste time with your friends when your chores are done. Now, come on, get to it.
All right, come on.
Anthony Daniels was not initially considered to be the final voice of C-3PO. He provided the voice on the set, what we call a guide track, which is there for timing purposes. But once the film began being put together in the editing room and the tracks of Tony Daniels were there as reference, everybody eventually just fell in love with them. And although it wasn't the original intention that 3PO would have a British accent, the fact that Tony was so good in the part and his body language was so coordinated with his vocal talents that it really didn't seem to make sense to try to develop another voice and impose it onto the 3PO character. It was just something that came about so successfully through the talents of Tony Daniels.
Yeah, I'm quite sure you'll be very pleased with that one, sir. He really is in first-class condition. I've worked with him before.
So eventually Tony was brought into the studio and all of his lines recorded properly. Those lines done on the set were hardly audible because of the face mask that's on him made it hard to pick his sound up clearly. And then the costume itself made a tremendous amount of noise, the plastic scraping and crackling as he talked. And none of the tracks of 3PO done on the set were usable. In fact, the sound of 3PO's costume was so noisy that it often required the replacement of dialogue by other actors in the scene because his suit made so much noise. Between R2 and 3PO, the R2 made a lot of noise and clunking around, and 3PO's costume pretty much required us to loop a lot of the other actors along the way.
I'm not even sure which planet I'm on.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that is farthest from.
I see, sir.
Well, you can call me Luke.
I see, Sir Luke.
The interesting thing about this film was when it was first released, people felt it moved very, very, very fast. It was extremely fast-paced. And part of that is because of the fact that you're introduced to a world you've never seen before. And everybody was sort of fascinated with the environment. And one of the premises I had when I made the film was that I would not show the environment. I would just assume that this was a natural world for everybody, and everybody was familiar with everything in it. So I wouldn't dwell on setting things up and, trying to explain what a droid is or trying to explain that this is the garage where they keep their skyhopper and about oil baths or all the things that you would normally try to deal with. I just assumed that everybody knew about all this stuff and moved the film along as quickly as I could. As a result, when it first came out, people were they couldn't take it all in fast enough. Now, when you look at the movie, it's not very fast at all. Everybody's familiar with these environments so that they don't spend a lot of time trying to see what is going on in the backgrounds. They just basically watch the story, and the story moves along at a rather leisurely pace by today's standard.
Who is she? She's beautiful.
I'm afraid I'm not quite sure, sir.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I think she was a passenger on our last voyage, a person of some importance, as I believe. Our captain was attached.
Is there any more to this recording?
So many people who've seen the film have thought this is a real hologram that we had for the film, but it really isn't, of course. It was pretty cleverly designed by George. He knew that from each of the different camera angles, he had to shoot Carrie Fisher from a different angle to sort of match that, and that's what he did. So, we popped Carrie down and added the beam going to it and ran it through sort of probably a TV screen, something like that, to give it a real TV electronic look. And when you put it all together, it looks like you're seeing a real hologram.
The original they did without the hood up. And when they saw it, I looked like a little bald human. So the last day of shooting on the first movie, I spent the whole day then, the morning into the afternoon, doing the whole thing over again. So it is in my head, General Kenobi, years ago you served my father in the Clone Wars. Now he begs you to help him struggle against the Empire. I regret that I'm unable to present my father's request. I had to do this for days and days. And they reshot it. They sprayed gold on my hair. So this represents for me many days. Okay, 2 days. Maybe 3 days of shooting the hologram speech.
The one you're carrying inside your rusty innards.
All right, I'll be right there, Aunt Peru.
I'm sorry, sir, but he appears to have picked up a slight flutter.
Here, see what you can do with him. I'll be right back.
The film ultimately is about a young farm boy and a young princess. So I was very keen to cast young people who carried themselves in such a way, one for Luke to be, a very innocent youth who lives on a farm and is kind of kept out of the mainstream of what's going on in the galaxy. And Princess Leia, who would be, very, very strong, and even though she's very young, very together and have a lot of authority, mixed up in a very complicated intergalactic drama of some kind.
Thought he might have meant old Ben. Do you know what he's talking about?
He's related to Ben.
So that's part of the quality I was looking for when I was casting the actors. The first requirement, obviously, is to get the very best actors possible. The second quality is to try to find people that sort of fit into your character, look and feel and are like your character. In this case, Luke was enthusiastic and innocent, and I think Mark had that quality that carried through to the movie.
I told you to forget it. Your only concern is to prepare those new droids for tomorrow. In the morning, I want them up there on the South Ridge working on those condensers.
This is, my next movie after American Graffiti, and in a way, the subject and everything is young people, and it's a subject that is the very same subject that American Graffiti is about a young boy leaving his world and going off into the unknown to a great adventure. American Graffiti focuses on that final night when that decision is made. Star Wars carries that story on to what happens after you leave. And in this particular case, there's a slightly more classic edge to it in that the fates are there to kind of help Luke realize that in certain cases, you don't have choices. If you choose not to fight evil, eventually it'll push you up into the wall, and you don't have a choice anymore. It's an inevitability that you can't escape from. And in this particular case, he's torn between what he really wants to do, which is go off and join the academy and fight in the rebellion and have excitement, but then he's also committed to helping his uncle and to help his uncle build his farm, and his uncle's raised him. He's like his father, and he has his obligations to, try to put the homestead together. It's very clear from the beginning here that Luke's fate, even when the aunt and the uncle are talking, is not to stay on the farm. That that's just not in him. That his destiny lies in a grander scheme of things. Even they know that. I mean, they know it for other reasons that we don't know about yet. But he is personally torn with this challenge of trying to do his busy work at home or take on the challenge that he has been chosen for in a grander scheme of things. His instinct is to be loyal and faithful to his aunt and uncle, but in the end, that doesn't work because the enemy has already made that decision for him. He doesn't really have much of a choice but to help right the wrongs of the universe. I mean, he could have ran, I guess, but we see from the very, very beginning that is really not his intention. His intention is to become engaged. His instinct is to become engaged, but he's suppressed by his more mortal obligations.
Boy, am I going to get it. That little droid is going to cause me a lot of trouble.
Oh, he excels at that.
The production designer, John Barry, was very instrumental in designing this homestead. He had been to Tunisia several times on movies, and he'd seen this city that was built underground. They dug holes in the ground and lived in them, and he showed some pictures to me, and I said, oh, this is marvelous. This is just what we need for the homestead, something really unique. I had said I wanted it to be out on a flat desert, but I couldn't even conceive of putting them in holes, but that turned out extremely well.
Look, there's a droid on the scanner. Dead ahead. Might be our little R2 unit. Hit the accelerator.
This bantha was actually shot in Death Valley. What we did is we got an elephant and dressed her up in a bantha suit, which was quite a drama. But in those days, that's about all you could do. You had a choice of stop motion animation or doing something like that. And if I wanted the Tusken Raiders to run and jump on the animal and ride off, it's almost impossible to do in stop motion animation. I mean, and have it look realistic. So these are the days where you dressed up elephants instead of creating them digitally. It was a very frustrating kind of experience because it limited a great deal of what kind of environment you could place the characters in and how many animals. And reality, I got, a couple of giant rubber dewbacks, which are those lizards, and I had a couple of elephants dressed like banthas, and that was about as far as I could go in terms of creatures and indigenous life forms on this planet.
One of the very few sound effects recorded during the location shooting was the mules, which were used to backpack the camera gear into the location in Tunisia. And I think it was Gary Kurtz, maybe George Lucas, that heard the braying of these mules and had the sound man go out and record them in the rocks. And they sent them back to me. They didn't really know what they were going to be used for, but it seemed to me that they were Tusken Raiders. And so the basis for the Tusken Raiders were really mules, which they were cut up a bit and changed in speed. And then eventually I did some more animals back here in the United States. I even recorded a person who could imitate a mule. And by taking those various recordings, we were able to come up with several different Tusken Raider voices.
Most of the characters in this follow the classic mythological archetypes of the young hero and in this case, with Obi-Wan Kenobi, the old wizard or the old man, the wise companion.
Don't be afraid.
The little magical companion, which is also connected with that idea, is R2-D2, who's usually this little insignificant character along the side of the road that they pick up. In this case, they pick up and he basically drives the whole story of what happens.
Ben Kenobi?
But there's always a teacher, someone who mentors the young hero in what his destiny is. And in this case, it's an old Jedi who has been sitting out in the desert, primarily waiting for this moment to happen.
I think he's searching for his former master, but I've never seen such devotion in a droid before. He claims to be the property of an Obi-Wan Kenobi. Is he a relative of yours? Do you know who he's talking about?
Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan. Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
When I wrote the original screenplay, I'd written a backstory for all the characters, so I knew where they came from. And since I was starting this whole thing in episode 4, I had to know kind of where all these characters came from and how they fit together and what the story was. So that was written up in a outline form with brief descriptions of who everybody was and where they came from. I never really intended it to be turned into a movie, but now it's the basis for episode 1, 2, and 3, which tells you how Obi-Wan got here in the first place.
The Sand people are easily startled, but they'll soon be back, and in greater numbers.
I had the outline, so I kind of knew how the dots connected, but then there's a whole story that has to fit around that. You have to sort of turn that into, another 6 hours of film. When all it really is just a little backstory of what the Jedi were like and what the Republic was like and what the relationship of Obi-Wan and Darth Vader was, and obviously Luke and Leia's relationship to Darth Vader, and the Emperor. What is the Empire? The thing about making a movie like this is you have to create a whole world. In this particular case, I guess it's a whole universe, but all the customs, all the politics, all the history, all the character motivations, everything has to be created. And since it's based on a very kind of old story and not a high-tech story, it's more of a fantasy film than a science fiction film.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
I was able to use archetypes, which helped develop the characters and put them in a context where they could be easily grasped because they are traditional characters that are easy to understand. I felt that was important in a movie like this, because if you're in a really bizarre, strange environment, if the lead characters have emotions and motivations that are very, very familiar to you, then it's very easy for you to grab onto something in the movie and make sense out of it. And this is the same story that has been told 1,000 times around the world for several thousand years.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.
Sure, go ahead. What is it?
Father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi.
George's idea of a lightsaber is just an amazingly neat thing to have, and everyone's so excited about it. The question that I always get asked when anyone asks me about special effects for the Star Wars films, it's the lightsaber. How do you do the lightsaber? And it's an animation effect. It's really pretty straightforward. George had on the set most of the time an actual sort of a rotating front projection object that was sort of like a, where the lightsaber would be. And the idea was to get it to be bright enough with front projection technique that it would actually look like it was really glowing and all, but it didn't work. And we ended up covering it up with an animation effect. But the actors could use it as a guide there. So they did actually have something in their hand that was a sort of a saber. And anyway, we covered it up with an animated effect that is just hand-drawn every frame and very, very bright, and added over the scene with some diffusion, some softening, so it looks like it's glowing and has an overexposure to it. And then the sound adds so much to it. If you watch this without any of the lightsaber stuff, without the sound turned on, it's completely different.
Now, the lightsaber was the very first sound that I ever manufactured for Star Wars. At the time I was just leaving USC Film School, I was a projectionist at the school. I had a part-time job. And in the projection booth were these old 35 millimeter theater projectors, which when they were just turned on and sat idle, they had a very interesting humming sound. It was part of the interlock motors in the projectors. And I used to be in the booth working, and I would enjoy that sound. It was a nice musical kind of hum. And when I saw the pictures of the lightsaber and the artwork for the film, I thought, wow, I think that hum of that projector motor is just the right thing. So I went and recorded the hum and held on to it as the basis for the lightsabers. As I thought about it some more, I felt that the hum was not quite dangerous enough sounding. It needed some other element. And the other element came about by accident. I had a microphone cable that was broken partially. And as I was carrying my tape recorder across my apartment one day and I went near the television set, the microphone picked up the buzz from the television picture tube, just a direct electronic interference. And I took the buzz and combined it with the projector hum, and the two sounds together became the basis for the laser sword.
For this sort of thing.
I can't get involved. I've got work to do. It's not that I like the Empire. I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it right now.
This scene is where Luke does struggle with his commitment to his uncle and his commitment to a larger destiny. At this point in time, even though you know from the beginning his heart is to go off on this adventure, he's caught in his obligations to the mundane, so to speak.
Look, I can take you as far as Anchorhead. You can get a transport there to Mos Eisley or wherever you're going.
You must do what you feel is right, of course.
In terms of personifying the Empire and not introducing the Emperor himself, I used the Governor Tarkin, who is in charge of the Death Star, as my main villain. I was very lucky to get Peter Cushing, who personifies the kind of character I had written as Governor Tarkin.
The Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
There's a complex relationship between the military in the Empire and the sort of more mystical power in the Empire, which is basically the Emperor and Vader. I went out of my way not to create hierarchies. The only real hierarchy is the Emperor. Everybody's afraid of the Emperor. Nobody will cross the Emperor, and the Emperor's the final word on everything. But Vader, as his assistant, even though he's very powerful and strong and scary, is one of the underlings of the Emperor, and therefore is pretty much on an equal scale with the highest level of underlings. A lot of that is backstory. It wasn't really important in this movie, other than that kind of a slightly offbeat relationship going on here. And it's not unless you see all the films put together that you begin to realize that the real story is obviously about Darth Vader. And in this particular movie, he's a rather pathetic character. He's a shadow of his former self. He's getting pushed around by bureaucrats.
Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data.
You know, it's not altogether what people originally thought Darth Vader was, which was this all-powerful king of the universe.
I find your lack of faith.
When Darth Vader crushes the neck of the rebel officer, the actual crushing of the officer's neck was produced by putting some walnut shells in a grapefruit rind and then crushing the whole thing. And so you got a smushing and a crackling all at the same time. And it seemed to sound like his neck was being broken.
Science fiction during this era was sort of a B-movie genre. Most of the most successful films were like Planet of the Apes. They made a moderate amount of money, and if they were made cheaply enough, they could make their money back. The only movie that actually made a lot of money at that point was 2001.
These are the same Jawas that sold us R2?
The studio insisted it'd be under $10 million. We said it would cost $13 million. They said we can't make it unless it's under 10, so we gave them a budget that said $9,999,099. And the budget came out to almost $13 million in the end. They didn't quite understand this movie. It was very strange. It was not a giant budget, but it was a medium-sized budget. So there was a certain amount of pressure on the executives to try to explain this movie, which they couldn't do. One of the tricky things about telling a story this way is I'm intercutting between Princess Leia's story and Luke's story. And there's obviously more going on in Luke's story, and the emphasis is on his side, even though she is the key to the whole movie. It's her battle with Darth Vader and with the Empire that is actually what the story is all about. If Luke had stayed put on Tatooine, he wouldn't even know the Death Star existed. But I have to keep her story and her drama alive during this whole thing, even though she's in the middle of something and Luke is on the road to discovery. She's pretty much in control of things. She's already a political leader and a senator and a rebel, and she's in the middle of her battle and her story. Her story is pretty simple. Get the plans, try to destroy the Death Star somehow. Where for Luke, it's a whole rite of passage coming into this big world that she already is a part of.
This guy was Dave Prowse, who was a British bodybuilder, and he was from Dorset, and we used to call him Darth Farmer. And no, princess, he had this Dorset accent that was so not ominous. If he hit his head, oh, sorry, George, can I? And he wasn't, you couldn't see his lips, so he'd make a mistake with the dialogue, and he'd want to do it again.
I went all over the place to record things. One of the places I went was to a company which tests jet engines inside before they're put on a full-size aircraft. And I went into their test chambers and put some microphones up. And of course, then you don't stay in the test chamber because they run the engines up to full speed in a tiny room, and the sound would probably kill you if you stayed in there. But I had a microphone in there wrapped in towels to kind of muffle the sound just a little bit. But out of that recording came the sound of reverse thrusters, which is the sound of a jet engine when an airplane, commercial jet, lands and it hits the runway. It actually reverses the airflow in the engines to slow the plane down. And that reverse thrusting, whining sound that the engine makes is what was used for the pass-bys of Luke's land speeder.
Mos Eisley Spaceport. You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
We had a few moments in Star Wars where we redid some of the sequences when it sort of became New Hope. And this is one of them, with all these little creature stuff, and all the, a way of opening up the vision beyond what George could afford, the first time around. And you can sort of see that this is sort of where his imagination was going. This was kind of a test for the 3 Star Wars films, the number 1, number 2, and number 3. To see if we had the technology and if it was affordable to be able to make these bigger shots, more creatures and stuff like that. And it certainly worked out well in the show. But it's quite a bit different than the original Star Wars. Just didn't have any of that scale at all on it.
How long have you had these droids? About 3 or 4 seasons.
They're up for sale if you want them.
Let me see your identification.
At the time this film was made, there were sort of aliens from outer space movies came and attacked Earth. But the idea of being on another planet that at first seemed just like another version of Earth with humans, and having the movie sort of deal primarily with humans and no aliens. The Empire is basically human, and when you go to Tatooine, you end up seeing a lot of humans or humanoid types. And the strangest thing really is the robots. If you thought about it for a minute, you would say, well, where are all the aliens? And so I played on that by going to the cantina, and suddenly the movie opens up into a whole other kind of world which exists, which is the world of aliens and strange creatures and all those sorts of factors, which at the time was a real shock. But now, 30 years later, there's aliens in all kinds of movies all over the place, so it's not as rare an experience as it was when this movie came out. The shock value of this scene, and it was one of the standout scenes when it was originally released, now is just another scene, but the plot moves along just the same because I didn't stop to make it outrageous. What I did is I shot the scene, but I didn't have very many creatures in it. We couldn't really afford to build the creatures, and it was very hard, and with the demands of the movie, we ended up with really the creatures you see in the wide shot of the scene here. When they first walk in and you look in and you see the bar, that is every single creature we had. It wasn't very many. And so this is another thing that when I came back later in second unit, we took a little corner built a little set, and most of the creatures that you cut to, that you see, that make that look exotic, were shot later. And the creatures were built by ILM.
I was around when George was shooting some of this. They just built one wall with a little, enclosure in it, and had probably about 10 different types of masks, as well as the musical group that they made a bunch of similar masks for. And over a period of a day or two, shot all these just inserts, these close-ups of the creatures, doing things, looking around, and playing the instruments and all. And it was just a really little, quick, kind of low-budget shoot, bunch of cheap creature masks. Any mask that we could find, we stuck in there. You even see a devil in there at one time, because that was one I think that Rick Baker had, and, we just used it in the film. It doesn't make any sense, but it textures the movie. So you see them all the way through the sequence.
The cantina really represents a sort of variety pack of all the different things I tried in the development of voices or robots for the film. It required so many different characters and voices, and there were unique individuals and aliens all throughout the place. And so out of the recordings I had been making of animals and of exotic foreign languages and the various processing I was doing, some of the sounds were dogs growling. There were the sounds of bats squeaking. There was a variety of different African languages. I recorded a number of different foreign students in conversation that could speak Swahili or Haya. I produced some electronic sounds for little voices. We also needed just a general what's called walla, that is the background babble of voices throughout the cantina going steady. And I actually made that by getting a group of the editors together on the film, and we all got into a room together, and we all got balloons full of helium. And everybody inhaled a good dose of helium, and now helium makes your voice go up in pitch, and of course it does make people laugh a little bit because it sounds funny. And if you had a variety of both male and female voices all on helium at the same time, it produced an interesting kind of babbling sound, which was used for a lot of the background voices in the cantina.
Han Solo. I'm captain of the Millennium Falcon. Chewie here tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system.
Han Solo is the foil to the idealistic Luke. He's the cynical mercenary, and Luke is the idealist, the dreamer, the one who is trying to do things to make it a better world. Han Solo is somebody who's been beaten down by the world and, really only cares about himself. Luke symbolizes the compassionate hero. Han Solo symbolizes the passionate hero. One cares about others, the other only cares about himself. And obviously, in the course of the movie, Han Solo's character arc is that he goes from being a self-centered, selfish, cynical character to a caring, compassionate, try to make this a better place kind of character. It's a fun part. It's a fun character.
10,000, all in advance.
10,000? We almost buy our own ship for that.
But who's gonna fly it, kid? You?
You bet I could. I'm not such a bad pilot myself. We don't just sit here and listen.
Good stories usually involve two people who are the opposite of each other. And a principal aspect of the story is how those two characters beat up against each other and how they interact with each other when they're as opposite as they are.
Okay, you guys got yourselves a ship. We'll leave as soon as you're ready. Docking Bay 94.
94.
Looks like somebody's beginning to take an interest in your handiwork.
All right, we'll check it out.
So I wanted it to have a realistic quality about it, so people who were from other planets and everything either spoke with an accent or they spoke another language completely. To kind of make it so it wasn't like a typical science fiction film where no matter where you come in the galaxy, you speak perfect English. I wanted it to have more of a realistic quality. There's a bit of controversy when I told everybody I was going to shoot this scene with subtitles. When we actually shot it, we just did it with him saying the lines, but I had been working on creating a voice for this guy.
The voice of Greedo was the first time we ever really heard Huttese spoken in Star Wars. And later, of course, Huttese would become a prominent language throughout the whole series. Huttese came about because in my search for interesting real languages, I came across a language called Quechuan, which was related to the Incan Indians of Peru. And it was a language that still did exist in remote parts of South America. And I brought into the picture a man named Larry Ward. And Larry was a linguist, and he was very good at hearing a foreign language and then imitating it, even though he didn't know how to speak it. He was very good at doing a double talk that made you believe that he could speak Italian or German very quickly. And then I played him the Quechuan, and taking Larry's voice and flanging it a little, that is, it made it sound a little bit like it was coming through that snout on his face. We were able to produce what became Greedo the Bounty Hunter.
Her resistance to the mind probe is considerable.
The breathing of Darth Vader was described in the script as a raspy, mechanical sound. I went to a local dive shop in San Rafael, California, and stuck a small microphone into a scuba regulator and recorded myself breathing through the mask itself. And it was that cold, mechanical breathing sound which I recorded, which became the basis for Darth Vader's breathing. The original script called for Vader to have all kinds of life support systems operating, that perhaps he was pieced together after some accident or something. And the sounds I made up for Vader on New Hope, he originally sounded more like a walking emergency room. He had all kinds of beeping and clicking and, raspy breathing, all those different things going on. And it was too busy and a little bit distracting. So it was pared down to just a cold, simple breathing, which became his sound signature.
Starting to demand. It'll be enough.
This scene was shot, and then when I started cutting the film, I realized that it was shot with an actor there, with the idea that I would make a stop-motion creature to put there. And when push came to shove, and ILM was way behind, and we were having lots of problems, I realized I didn't need this scene. It wasn't telling the story of this particular movie. It was really in there for the movies later on when Han Solo gets kidnapped. But if I never made those movies, then it wasn't necessary. And obviously, when push came to shove, between the difficulty of actually creating a stop-motion creature and the time and money it would take to do it, I just cut the scene out of the movie. But I always wanted it back. And then once I started making the other movies, I desperately wanted it back because it's the introduction of Jabba the Hutt, who becomes a central character later on. And that was the advantage of the special edition, to get this put back into the movie. And it also introduced Boba Fett, who also becomes a character later on.
15, Jabba, don't push it.
You can only do so much storytelling before you run up against the technology. And then you just say, well, we can't do that. We have to do something else. And in fantasy films and science fiction films or historical epics or something, you always run up against that. Problems with cinema is you actually have to create the reality for at least a moment. And that's, a lot of trickery, but at some point it has a basis in real things, sets and costumes and special effects and camera tricks and sound, to create the illusion of some kind of a reality that never existed. That can be a challenge at times. Just the physical thing of how do you get a Wookiee to talk?
Ultimately, Chewie's voice was made up of mostly recordings of bears. And eventually I was led to a cute little pet bear named Pooh, who lived on a farm in Tehachapi, California. And I would take the sounds and break them down into groupings that had different emotions that I associated with them. I took the angry sounds and put them in one collection. I took the cute sounds and put them in another. I took the sounds which sounded like an animal asking a question. At least the intonation was such that it sounded inquisitive. And once the sounds had been broken down into their individual parts, you could then edit them together and form little sequences of sound, and in that manner build up some sense as to what Chewie was saying. And it was good because the sound a bear makes is kind of from the back of the throat. There's no articulation of the lips to form consonants. It went along well with Chewie's mask, which basically could only open and close the mouth. There wasn't really any lip articulation to speak of. And so the actual sounds from the bear seemed to work well with the mask of Chewbacca, because you could believe that those types of sounds were coming from a mouth the way it operated on Chewie.
It's like an Imperial cruiser or passengers hotter than I thought. Try and hold them off. Angle the deflector shield while I make the calculations for the jump to light speed.
One of the problems with having a movie in outer space is that there's great distances. And so one of the classic ways of dealing with that problem is to go into hyperspace or into some alternate reality where you can move through space at extremely high speed so you can get people from point A to point B without it taking forever. That's one of the bases for teleportation in Star Trek. It's really just a cinematic way of getting you up and down from the planets without having to jump in a shuttle every time you go. And in this particular case, I wanted a visualization of that. What would it be? Well, you'd start going really, really fast. And if you start going really, really fast, the whole stars would just sort of streak by you. I mean, there's an obvious influence there from 2001, which is the Stargate sequence, which is things streaming by camera. But mostly it was just a device that I needed to get from point A to point B quickly. And at the time, it created quite a visual event, which I didn't even realize until I saw it with an audience. It was just going into hyperspace. We got so used to it, we never even thought of it as anything. And it was never designed really to be a entertainment event. It was really designed just, well, we got to get from here to there. So you do it and no big deal. It was one of those things that was pretty surprising because I didn't think anybody would like, it's like going into hyperspace. It's no big deal. But that had a spectacular reaction from the audiences at the time who hadn't experienced anything like that.
You don't know how hard I found it signing the order to terminate your life.
I'm surprised you had the courage to take the responsibility of...
Sometimes, well, a lot of the times you think things are going to get a reaction and they don't. That's a rather depressing reality. It's rare that you do something that you don't realize is going to get a reaction. A lot of the things about these fantasy films, and Star Wars in particular, is that you create a world, you live in that world for 3 or 4 years. So the things that you take for granted, you don't even think about anymore. And so when an audience sees it for the first time, they're like shocked. And you're completely familiar with everything, so it doesn't affect you the same way. And the irony is now everybody's sort of so familiar with Star Wars that there isn't anything in here that's, you can't shock people anymore. The only way you can actually experience that is to watch it through the eyes of a 6 or 7 year olds who've never seen the movies before. And then you get that experience, but that experience was shared by everyone when the movie first came out.
Dantooine. You're on Dantooine.
There, you see, Lord Vader, she can be reasonable. Continue with the operation. You may fire when ready.
What?
You're far too trusty. Dantooine is too remote to make an effective demonstration, but don't worry. We will deal with your rebel friends soon enough.
Oh.
The explosion of the planet here was actually a pyrotechnic explosion at the very top of a building, at the roof of it, shot in the dark, looking up, and the explosion then, as pieces fly apart, fall down toward the camera, and that's added over the scene of the planet there to make it look like the planet is blowing up.
Are you all right? What's wrong?
I felt a great disturbance in the Force, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. I fear something terrible has happened. You better get on with your exercises.
Well, you can forget your troubles with those Imperial slugs. I told you I'd outrun them.
This is the chess sequence that was all stop-motion animation with a bunch of cute little puppets that Phil Tippett and John Berg made, all animated one frame at a time. And it was really cute. People really liked the characters in this. And there really is the size that they look there. They're only about, probably about 5 or 6 inches tall and transparent because they too were supposed to be holograms.
all the voices in the hologram are my voice, repeated different ways. I kind of got down to the end of the production and was running out of time when this material finally came in. And out of desperation, I pretty much sat down and just made up the voices myself. Ran them through a filter so they sounded tiny, and then put them together and orchestrated them in the little voices in the little fight that takes place on the chessboard.
Let the Wookiee win.
One of the themes of the movie is high technology and romance. The romantic human. One of the human qualities is that romantic quality, that quality of honor and justice and everything that we equate as human in the way we focus and conduct our lives. In this particular case, I was looking for a symbol of sort of a more humane, honorable way of being a warrior, as opposed to the mechanical, heartless, machine-like approach to killing and battle and war. One of the main influences here was the samurai ethic and King Arthur and the King Arthur ethic, where you have a very strong set of ethical rules that you live by. The lightsaber became the symbol of that humane way of conducting your life, even in the worst possible way, which is to protect yourself by killing someone. I wanted something that was romantic like a sword, but I wanted it to be high-tech and sci-fi to fit into this world, and it was out of that I came up with the idea of a sword that was created out of a laser. It could cut through anything, but it can be turned on and off like a flashlight.
Stretch out with your feelings.
This floating thing that is moving around here, I believe it was started by shooting against just a blue background, sort of like a little object that's being held by a pole and being rotated around. The camera then panning around, tilting around to make it look like it's moving, and then comped into the shot to look like Luke's reacting to it with his saber. And it needed a lot of work. I remember later on we had to reposition it and move it around to put it in the right place because we couldn't quite get it positioned correctly when we were shooting the different elements for it.
Almost see the remote.
That's good. You've taken your first step into a larger world. Yes?
Our scout ships have reached Dantooine. They found the remains of a rebel base, but they estimate that it has been deserted for some time. They are now conducting an extensive search of the surrounding systems.
Coming up with what hyperspace looked like from the inside was a trick. What we did is took some aluminum foil and photographed it with a high-con negative and then pulled the camera back through a rotating cylinder to create that, what would it look like if you were traveling through hyperspace. And there's one of the concepts that has sort of been controversial is the fact that when Han Solo talks about getting from point A to point B, he talks in terms of parsecs, which is distance rather than time. The premise being that in order to travel through hyperspace, you have to plot a course around all of the stuff, all of the planets and stars and everything. So the fastest way to 2 points is a straight line. And it's up to your Navi computer and your navigation skills. That's what makes you go fast. And in particular case of the Millennium Falcon has an extremely sophisticated navigation system. So the reason it's the fastest ship in the galaxy is not because it actually has speed, but it has navigational skills that allows it to go from point A to point B faster than anybody else. And of course that was never explained, and people got very confused by it. But if you follow the story, I think you would figure it out that speed is determined by distance. I mean, the speed that you get to a point is the distance you travel. If there's a lot in the way, and if you fly through something, it'll obviously destroy you. So the idea is you got to plot a course around everything and get there in the fastest route.
I think you're right. Full reverse. Chewie, lock in the auxiliary power. Chewie, lock in the auxiliary power.
Why are we still moving forward?
Caught in a trap and it's pulling us in.
There's got to be something you can do.
There's nothing I can do about it, kid. I'm full power. I'm going to have to shut down. You're not going to get me without a
The
fight.
Death Star model is probably about 3 feet across, and each time that you see it, it gets bigger and bigger in the frame, and we're moving closer and closer to our model. The actors, of course, are just in front of a cockpit set with a blue screen beyond it. And each time you get closer again, you get closer and closer on it, and we have a shot that we're looking at an area probably about 4 or 5 inches wide on the model, but when you put the little Falcon in there, it looks very, very large, which really helps. Then we go to a couple of paintings that I believe Ralph McQuarrie did when they were getting very, very close to entering the docking bay. And again, the little Falcon model is comped in there. Actually, it's a 4-foot-long model, but shot from way across the stage and looks like it's very, very tiny in the frame and makes the Death Star look cute. Then the docking bay interior was a separate model also. It was made by the model shop, and the Falcon shot separately against blue screen, motion control, and moved in there with all the lights getting bright on it to look like it's actually entering into the area, but shot at a different time.
Its markings match those of a ship that blasted its way out of Mos Eisley.
They must be trying to return the stolen plans to the princess. She may yet be of some use to us.
Unlock 1, 5, 7, and 9. Release charge.
And the idea was to make a very lived-in world, a very, what Kurosawa would call an immaculate reality. You know, I was very conscious of that when I made the movie. I wanted to make it a world that absolutely looked like it had been lived in. They were not sets, they were not created, but it's a real ship that people use for a long time. So it's got, everything is like that. Which is, one of the reasons why the sets are all beat up. Well, everybody's, I tried to create a world that was lived in and had a sense of realism about it, even though it's completely, fantastic. It's not real at all. But you get a sense of it's a lived-in world. It's not, perfectly manufactured the way it actually was. It's very natural in science fiction films for everybody to want to keep everything clean and neat, and we're constantly having problems on the set of everybody wanting to wipe off the set so that shiny surfaces, the floors are always shiny. And I said, well, that's okay, but people do walk on these floors. These aren't floors that nobody ever walked on, and they should look like they've been walked on. I mean, there's a whole department in a movie set that does nothing but clean things off. They were very upset on this movie that I wasn't allowing them to clean anything up.
The kit's all yours. If scanners pick up anything, report it immediately.
If you listen to the Death Star and you go to different locations in it, you're pretty much always hearing a low rumble. And quite often you hear a rhythmic pounding, kind of like a big heartbeat. And that was a deliberate attempt to kind of give the space station a sense of being alive and very powerful.
Hey, down there!
A lot of the doors on the Death Star, the clattering of the doors opening or closing and the banging of the doors, were recorded at Mount Palomar Observatory in California. I had gone up there and had the privilege of going inside the giant telescope room and recording the big motors that rotate the telescope and the big shutters which open and close on the dome. And it was in a huge echoey space. And a lot of those recordings from Mount Palomar ended up being incidental mechanical sounds in the Death Star.
This scene was a fun scene for me. It was one of my favorite scenes in the movie. It's the one chance that Luke and Han get to actually play a scene together. I mean, everything else is in the middle of chaos and action, and then toward the end when they say goodbye they get to play a scene together, but this is the one time they get to actually interact in a fun way, and Harrison and Mark were so good in it together. I mean, they were just, they really were able to play off each other well and make it come real. Harrison had his character down so pat. It's that clash between the idealist and the pragmatist, and this is the one scene I got to really have them bang into each other.
A power loss at one of the terminals will allow the ship to leave.
I had a relationship with Harrison that was a relationship with Harrison, and I had a relationship with Mark, and it was sort of like never the twain shall meet. There was a big age difference between them, and I was kind of the young one, but they were very different. So if there was hanging out to do, it's kind of either you'd go with one or the other. Harrison had two kids. He was 33 years old. I was 19. Mark was somewhere in the middle. And I guess Mark was kind of trying to decide his life in terms of the film. But there was a little bit of a kind of a competition maybe between the two of them, and maybe in Mark's mind more. Because it's a difficult dynamic when you have a trio and whoever's going to be in the trio, either it'll be two males or two females, that'll perhaps develop a competition. And Harrison is more a loner than Mark. Mark kind of likes to entertain the crew, and maybe, and there was a competition.
Level 5, detention block AA-23. I'm afraid she's scheduled to be terminated.
I'm a big old movie aficionado, and I looked at Harrison and I thought, he's got that epic face and that leading man thing. This is going to go.
I'm not going anywhere.
They're gonna execute her. Look, a few minutes ago you said you didn't want to just wait here to be captured. Now all you want to do is stay?
Marching into the detention area is not what I had in mind.
But they're gonna kill her!
Better her than me.
She's rich.
And when George cast this, he wanted to cast all our parts with people with big personalities. And he did that, and they had to be big personalities that worked well together. But I think, too, they based the rest of the relationships in 2 and 3 on how we behave together in this movie. So I guess that kind of means Harrison and I were a little bit combative but friendly. But those are the values that work in all those old films. So it certainly wasn't entirely, decided by how we were together. But that was, you wouldn't, if you were going to cast His Girl Friday, you wouldn't put Mark and I in the screaming at each other roles.
Lock the door.
And hope they don't have blasters.
That isn't very reassuring.
Harrison was rewriting stuff a little bit, and he was a grown-up anyway, by the way, of the group. He was allowed to change his dialogue because he could do it. And I paid a lot of attention to that. I wanted to be able to do that. And I, having been brought up on these old films where dialogue was a heavy part of them because they were based on plays and the early movies were just, dialogue heavy. I kind of understood initially what he was doing, but not entirely. But I watched him closely and really watched him closely on the next movie. And I could rewrite his stuff any day of the week because it's fun to do. But it's not as easy to change my dialogue because when I would change it, I would make it funny. And really, she's not that funny.
This is not gonna work. Why didn't you say so before? I did say so before.
The story is ultimately about Princess Leia and her attempts to destroy the Death Star as a rebel leader. And the boys kind of just tag along on her adventure. In this particular film, you don't really understand all the relationships between everybody and where everybody came from. But I was very keen on making a movie that was like watching a foreign film where you just didn't know the world you were in. You didn't know what was going on. You didn't know the politics. You didn't know anything, and nothing was explained to you. So you simply were thrown into this world, and there's an adventure going on, and you have to kind of get with it. As opposed to a traditional fantasy film where they spend a lot of time sort of explaining everything. Unfortunately, I'm now in the position of having to explain everything, but
We gotta find out which cell this princess of yours is in.
One of the fun things for me about this movie was that I was making it episode 4, which is why I was so adamant about having that on the film. It's ironic that I was wanting it on the film to explain why I haven't explained anything. And the studio was afraid to advertise it that way for fear that they would say, well, where are the other movies? And I don't know. They didn't know how to sell it. But the concept here was that all this stuff has happened, and you're never going to know about it. That was like 2 weeks ago on Saturday. If you didn't come to that one, and your friends didn't see it, then you just wouldn't have any clue of what they're talking about. You know, we meet again, and all. You know, well, that was in episode 3. You know, and it never was intended that you'd ever know what that was. And it's fun now for me in a way to be able to do the first 3 stories so that you know some of the things that are going on here. But this was always intended to be a kind of, what in the world is going on in this movie? I don't understand. You know. But in one way, it all makes sense. You can sort of follow it. But in another way, most of the information is not there at all. And that's a particular case of the confrontation between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. You know, there's some relationship they have to each other, because they talk about meeting again and the problems, and now I'm going to get you and all this kind of stuff. There's some kind of old battle going on here that we don't know anything about. So it is, works amazingly well, considering all it is ultimately this one scene between him and Tarkin where he says, here, he's come for me, and it's our destiny is to meet up again. And I'm going to handle this myself.
Princess?
I have to.
Put all sections on alert.
Obi-Wan is here. The Force is with him.
If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape.
Escape is not his plan. I must face him alone.
The laser guns were developed on the basis of one particular sound. I was hiking in Pennsylvania on a vacation during the early stages of the production of Star Wars, and I was hiking over a mountaintop in the Pocono Mountains and went beneath a radio tower which had large guy wires coming down to anchor it, and my pack caught on one of these guy wires, and as I went by, it made a twanging sound, an unusual sound. And I immediately said to myself, well, that's a laser gun. It had an otherworldly sound to it. And when I returned to California, I went around Southern California in the region of Los Angeles, banging on the guy wires of different radio towers to come up with just the right sound. I finally found the right radio tower out in the Mojave Desert, near Palmdale, California. There was a small radio station out there which had a sort of broken down tower next to its little transmitting station. They had one particular guy wire which was did not have the wind dampeners on it. Sometimes they have these large styrofoam balls on the wires which prevent them from vibrating. They're actually there to reduce the drag of the wind on the wires. And I found this one particular cable on that tower and banged it with different pieces of metal. And out of that came the sound which was used as the basic sound for all the laser guns.
Well, this is, again, one of those Saturday matinee ideas, which is they get out of one mess into a bigger mess, which is a principle I used on Raiders of the Lost Ark a lot. It's kind of a fun thing to do because you get your characters into the worst possible mess, and then just when you think they're getting out of it, they get into a worse mess, and it just keeps compounding. And you have, instead of, like here, they fell into a hole they can't get out of, and the guys are going to come and get them in a second. That's bad enough. But then there's some kind of creature living in this thing with them who, can kill them. And then on top of that, it's a crusher that crushes garbage, and it'll crush them all. So you just keep piling the problems on top of each other until you can't stand it anymore. And then you get into a situation, and you're writing something like this where it begins to take over, and you say, how am I going to get Luke free from this monster? and you have lots of choices. And obviously, the easiest one is to have a hand shoot it and let it go and go away. But that isn't much fun. So when you get in there and you know where things are going, then when the walls start to close, the Ninoga runs away and hides in a little space that protects him from the walls. So things start to tell their own story after a while. You say if you got the thing, he lives in there, this thing closes all the time, he must have figure out a way not to get squashed, which would mean that he would let go of Luke and release him. And then the next problem would start, which would be the doors closing.
There's a thing in the trash compactor called a Dianoga, and Mark used to sing, "Pardon me, George, could this be Dianoga poo-poo?" And Mark went so crazy on the acting with the Dianoga strangling him and taking him under the water or whatever that was, that he blew a vein in his eye that made a red dot in his eye. And right after this, we filmed the medal giving scene at the end. So there had to be big grinning so that you couldn't see this big red dot in his eye. He was very committed to being strangled.
Don't just stand there, try and brace it with something!
One of the joys of being a sound editor is when you can really create an off-screen world. And the Trash Masher is a great example of this because when it starts up, everything that happens really is off-screen. The sounds of the mechanism falling into place, the sound of the motor starting and accelerating as it begins to, close in on our heroes. And of course, none of that really exists. There's no real mechanics there. I guess there was, the set could be collapsed. I was probably manually driven. I really don't know. But it can be very satisfying to, take motor sounds and dumpster door creaks and the sound of a pile driver, which was used for the acceleration, the pounding of the Trash Masher as it got, tighter and tighter on our group of heroes.
Come on.
In fact, the original Star Wars was mixed 3 different times because there were actually 3 different mixes that went out to the public. The first mix done was a 2-channel stereo Dolby mix, which hadn't been done before. It was a new process. That mix was done first because actually making prints and testing them out and getting theaters to tune up their equipment required that mix be done first. After that was done, then a 6-track stereo mix was done for the 70mm release of the film. And of course, going back and mixing the film a second time, one makes changes and you take things a little further. You've learned from the first mix of the movie and you now go and make all your changes in the next mix, which was the 6-track. And that mix went out, and that was what people heard in the 70mm releases of the film. Then there was a third mix done, which is a monaural mix. Now, at the time, most theaters, the majority of theaters, were just monaural. They would play, all the sound would play through one speaker behind the screen. And so it was important that we address the requirements of those theaters since they were in a majority. And so a third mix of the film was done, which was combining everything monaurally into one channel. And there were changes made in that mix because each time we'd come back to it, George Lucas would listen to the film and look at it and he'd have a few new ideas and some things would get changed and added in. So what the public heard in 1977, depending on what theater you went to see it in and hear it, you may have heard a different mix. And there are differences, some differences in voices, some differences in sound effects, either present or absent. Not really any music changes, but there were changes in the relationship of music and effects and dialogue.
Listen to them. They're dying, R2. Curse my metal body. I wasn't fast enough. It's all my fault. My poor master.
It was fantastic working with Alec. is a great actor and helpful and supportive and everything you want in an actor. He could be a little mischievous at times, but he is a good writer and really knows cinema, and so it was very easy to collaborate with him. And I think he brought a lot of calmness to the set, which was helpful. In terms of the crew and stuff would quiet down when he was around and show a little bit more respect, and the actors would not clown around quite so much and become a little bit more serious about their work when he was on the set.
And just to avoid any more female advice, we ought to be able to get at it. So let's get moving.
We did have one big issue. Originally in the script, he went all the way to the end of the movie and wasn't killed. And I got down to this point in the movie, and then I realized that after they leave the Death Star, Alex's character, Obi-Wan Kenobi, didn't have anything to do. He was just sort of standing around. He's this big, strong Jedi, and you kind of would expect him to take over. But it's really important that Luke take over, and really Luke and Han's characters that save the day and pull this thing out, not powerful Jedi. And so I came to the conclusion that what needed to happen, he needed to die at that point. But I needed him in the next movie, if I ever make another movie. So we talked about it, and he wasn't very happy about being killed off at that point. But because this was during the making, I was rewriting the script as I was shooting the movie, and it was during the shooting that I came up with this idea of having him not be in the end of the movie. And let's say he, in the beginning, was a little taken aback by the idea, but later on I convinced him it basically worked for the plot device here of moving Obi-Wan on, but still keeping him around for the few really important lines he had. A lot of these things become very practical and evolve over time.
You're braver than I thought.
Now, the laser blasts that are in the Star Wars movies are really pretty neat. They're all hand-drawn, animated on old-fashioned Oxbury animation stands. And they took quite a while to do. And Adam Beckett was in charge of the animation department on this show. And at the beginning of the project, he believed in his soul of souls that the laser beams should be absolutely parallel, one side of it to the other. And he imagined doing these beams on giant cutout sheets of plastic about 20 feet long, with cards moving along and revealing little parts of them at a time. So again, when you shot a little bit of it, you see through it, but see a little section of the 20-foot long backlit image that became the laser blast. But it ended up being way too complicated and expensive and time-consuming to do it. So they're actually done just on animation cell, probably about 2 or 3 feet wide.
A lot of this kind of acting is sort of reacting. I mean, there's squibs going off and you're running around and you're yelling at people a lot. So there's no time for really any moments. It's mostly determined by the speed of the events. And I think when we saw all of this, we were shocked.
Here, hold it.
I split the teams up and had them both go through their little series of adventures here. The swing across the Death Star Canyon was really, again, in the tradition of the old serials, Tarzan, Zorro, Errol Flynn movies, Robin Hood. They always had a swinging scene of some kind. It also was a chance to sort of bond Princess Leia and Luke, who, unbeknownst to them at this point, are brother and sister, but to give them that moment of connection, because it does play out later when Luke has fallen in love with her and Han is falling in love with her, and so there's a little rivalry going on between the two of them.
Where could they be?
This confrontation with Obi-Wan and Vader, it works just as a confrontation between the good guy and the bad guy. I mean, Obi-Wan's, at this point, the strongest good guy. He's the one that has the most knowledge. The father figure that has taken on Luke, and then you have the bad father figure who is the evil father. And the subtext of this, which is that this is the culmination of a larger issue, has never really played, I think, for people. It's really just a confrontation between bad and good. And then the surprise is, at the end of this, is that Vader doesn't kill him, but that he's able to join the Force and, by being one with the Force, influence things in a more powerful way than he can just being a Jedi.
Your power is a weak old man.
In these days, sword fighting was not quite as sophisticated as it was during the height of the Jedi period. In this particular rendition, Vader was, half man, half machine. Obi-Wan was pretty much an old man. And so this fight was a hard fight for them. It wasn't a acrobatic, jump around, fast fight. It was a kind of hard fight to fight because they're both kind of old Jedi.
The hits of the lightsabers were a combination of several different sources, principally a carbon arc being ignited. The old motion picture projectors and large, bright lamps at the old studios, the actual light was produced by burning two carbon rods, running electricity through them, and then a spark would jump between them and they'd actually burn. And when you start up one of these carbon arcs, there's a jump of sparks from one rod to another, and it makes a wonderful squeaking sound, and you can play around with it. You get a spark and a squeaking at the same time. In addition, there were sounds of dry ice and metal combined. If you take a piece of metal and place it against a piece of dry ice, you get a squeaky sound as the dry ice evaporates. And taking the dry ice sounds as well as the carbon arc sounds and combining them together made up the sounds of the lightsaber hits.
Story-wise, the critical point here was that Luke is left on his own, that he has to now confront his destiny and do it on his own. With his only real help is his belief in the Force, through the communications with Ben on the other side. But basically, there's no one to help him but himself.
Run, Luke, run!
This was a little bit of an issue, which is I got the Millennium Falcon into the spaceport, and then I didn't know how to get it out. So, after a long and lots of discussions and wranglings and everything, I said, well, why don't we just back it out and turn it around real fast? And that's ultimately what we did. But it's one of those funny things that you get into when you sort of get yourself logistically into a situation. And you say, well, okay, how are we going to get this thing out of here in a hurry? It wasn't getting it out of here, but how do you do it in a hurry? Do we back it in to begin with? Those are the kind of issues ultimately that drive you crazy. And they're very simple, kind of not really that important, but in the end they actually are, and you do have to solve it.
Can't believe he's gone.
There wasn't anything you could have done.
Come on, buddy, we're not out of this yet.
I wanted the battle scenes in this film to be very cinematic and not slow, and I wanted it to be lots of pans, lots of moves, very much like a World War II movie. And I wanted to use all the power of editing and speed and cinema to tell the story and make it as exciting as possible. At this point, special effects, you had to do it kind of like 2001, which you could just sort of have everybody sit there, but you couldn't pan, you couldn't move, you couldn't do anything. It had to be very static. And the big breakthrough we had on this movie was to be able to create the motion control camera, which allowed us to shoot several layers and have them all be precisely the same so you could combine them together at some point, and it would all look real. So using that technology, I was able to create a sequence that, in this particular case, was very much like a bomber during World War II, 12 o'clock high, lots of those films where you had large bombers fighting off lots of German fighters. And in order to mock the sequence up, I would use footage from documentary films and various films to show how I wanted the planes to fly through the frame. Sometimes it would be World War I planes, World War II planes, just shots from anything and everything to say, I want a plane to go from here to there and be like this. And you just take whatever you could find that was the shot you were looking for or similar.
I got him!
Kid, don't get cocky!
There's still 2 more of them out there.
TIE ships are all shot motion control, and the actors are shot in front of a blue screen, just pretending they're shooting at something. And then we put the TIE ships into the laser blasts and the separate explosion elements to make it look like they're all, in the middle of a big combat fight. George had put together scenes for this sequence as well as for the final battle and edited them together and sort of gave us, you'd call an animatic or a visual moving guide for what the shot should look like. And we would follow that very closely. He'd have all his live action scenes and then cut in one of these scenes from another movie or a World War II film, and we would essentially come in and copy the feel of it and the action of it. And he would say, well, actually, the ship's going, a lot faster than it is here, and make it a little bit smaller in the frame and like that.
Are they away?
For me, in terms of a film this complex, it was the only way I could describe to all the people at ILM that were working on these shots what I wanted the shot to actually look like, in detail, so I didn't have to, actually do the shot myself. And it was critical to how the movie worked, because the kinetic energy and the drama is really created in the motion. It's really in the cinema. For something that's complex, that's a real problem. In a normal movie, what you'd basically do is you'd go out with some storyboards and stuff, and you'd get a bunch of airplanes and some special effects guys, and you do some explosions, and you set about 5 or 6 cameras up, and then you cut it all later. You just have good cameramen, they get good angles, they air-to-air footage and all this kind of stuff, and then you cut it together into a movie. But to try to think that through ahead of time and say, this is how long the shot's going to be, this is what it's going to look like, it was very important that I was very precise about how long a shot was, because the cost of the film was directly related to how many frames they had to shoot. It's like an animated film. I had to say exactly how many frames it was going to be, and then how it fit into the next shot, and how each shot fit together, and then how that all played.
So, what do you think about it? Trying not to, kid. Good. Still out of spirit. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think a princess and a guy like me? No.
It was always a challenge of how far I could go in the film before it, would be silly. How much fun I could have without it destroying the credibility of the movie. And the approach I took on the film was pretty much similar to what I had done on American Graffiti, which is kind of realistic but humorous approach to the characters so that they could have fun and be kind of lighthearted in rather intense situations, and have that be amusing in itself without sort of winking at the camera and winking at the movie and saying this is all just a big joke. By having the characters at least take it seriously. It's a thin line. James Bond had created a kind of film that's roughly in this vein, but had much more self-consciousness about what it was doing. We're sort of in the same genre, but I wanted to be a subtler, to set the tone that it could create enough tension and be exciting for everybody, but still be fun enough to kind of enjoy as a movie, but then not have parents sort of say, I don't want to go see this movie. Say this is too childish for me. So I was trying to walk that tight line that I had successfully walked in American Graffiti, and was hoping I could do again here.
Planet Yavin. The rebel base is on the moon on the far side. We are preparing to orbit the planet.
In this scene in the briefing room, the computer image on the screen is really one of the first computer images used in a feature film. And it was created on a computer. It wasn't done in traditional animation. It was actually, that's real computer animation. And that's sort of the level that it was at that point when we made this movie. All the rest of the animation in the movie is traditional cell animation.
ILM wasn't really involved in the graphics here. I think they were done by Larry Kuba, and they were very early vector graphic, effects, and they were quite a project for them to do, and they were pretty neat to look at. But they were sort of a foreshadowing of what was to come in even the movie business. This is representing the Death Star trench, and if we were to redo the film today, we certainly would do that with computer graphics, and you would have to start with computer models that look very much like the same thing here.
To the reactor system. A precise hit will start a chain reaction which should destroy the station. Only a precise hit will set up a chain reaction. The shaft is ray shielded, so you'll have to use proton torpedoes.
That's impossible, even for a computer.
It's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home.
The end of this, I was setting up, there's this other theme of friendship and compassion and camaraderie and caring about community, which is symbolized by Han Solo. And I really wanted to set up the idea that Han wasn't going to return and make that as big a surprise as I could. In this particular case, I think the danger of the Death Star and the situation sort of makes it so that you accept the fact that he left without thinking that, it's really important that he come back, because you can't see why it would be important that he come back. It's just that you're disappointed that he doesn't kind of join the cause, that he remains solo, so to speak.
You got your reward and you're just leaving then?
That's right, yeah. Got some old debts I gotta pay off with this stuff. Even if I did, you don't think I'd be fool enough to stick around here, do you?
There's a real challenge of shooting this giant hangar when I only had 2 ships. I had the one that's behind Han, and then I had the X-Wing that's next to Luke in the scene, and that was all I had to create this giant hangar scene with all these ships. It was all done with basically 2 little set pieces. I didn't have a giant space. I didn't have a big hangar or anything, so most of it's just turn the lights out and make it dark. It's just the walls of the soundstage back there. But all of these shots, we moved these ships around. There's only 2 of them. And we kept moving them around so it looked like they were behind everybody. And I'm saying every time we'd shoot an angle, they'd go and they'd move the ships all around to fit that angle. And I'd shoot that, then I'd do another angle. They'd move all the ships over here to be in this thing.
What's wrong?
Oh, it's Han. I don't know. I really thought he'd change his mind.
He's got to follow his own path. No one can choose it for him.
I only wish Ben were here.
Once again, you have to be kind of inventive and low budget as you go along. A lot of the voices that you hear in the PA system in the Masasi Outpost hangar was just myself and 2 other friends I had, John and Tom Silla. We got a bullhorn and went up to a local church when there was no one around, and it was a big stone church, so it had a lot of nice echo in it. And we just read lines through the bullhorn, things like prepare X-Wings for liftoff, and so on, etc. And then took those lines of dialogue recorded in the very echoey space, and then later, distributed them where needed in the mix to give the outpost and the hangar a sense of it being alive with military activity.
Not on your life. That little droid and I have been through a lot together. You okay, R2? Good.
Hang on tight, R2. You've got to come back. You wouldn't want my life to get boring, would you?
It's important that we get a little sense of them getting ready for battle and all these guys getting in the ship. This is one of those days where we didn't have much time. I had to shoot the scenes, and then at the very end of the day, they said, okay, now let's just get some shots of the rest of the takeoff stuff. And I wanted it to be this kind of elaborate, preparation thing. I had to shoot this whole thing in about an hour because it wasn't a story item. It didn't get scheduled as its own day. It just got tagged on to the end of a day.
Luke, The Force will be with you.
Scripts like this, in a way, write themselves. I mean, I got to do something with the princess. I either stick her in an airplane and have her go out there. And since she is a leader and a commander and everything, she probably wouldn't do that. So naturally, you'd put her around something where she can sort of follow the battle some way. And the convention of the World War II movies is it's always very dramatic when you're listening to a battle rather than watching it.
All wings report in. Red 10 standing by.
And I wanted to use realistic crosstalk and futz dialogue. We took it and ran it through a shortwave and made it sound really rough and terrible so that it gave you, again, sound-wise, the equivalent of the beat-up environment. So it was beat-up sound.
Mechanic failed. Hold tight. Put your deflectors on double front.
The end battle was fabricated from many different elements, and they all had to orchestrate together in harmony. Principal among them was the voices, the radio voices of all the pilots and the controllers in the war room. And George Lucas wanted it to sound realistic. So we took all of the lines of dialogue and we actually transmitted them over a shortwave radio. And then at the receiving end of the shortwave, we had a tape recorder, and we were able to receive the voices as they were transmitted, and also then to mistune the receiver a bit so that you could have voices come and go as if the signal was being interrupted or wavering off the actual wavelength. And so when the final mix was being put together, the original voices are there, the radio transmission voices are there in different forms, and a blend was made, depending on whether the character was on screen or off screen. And this added to the depth of the whole scene. It made it seem like there was transmission distances between the ships and the war room, and that the ships, of course, were going through their aerobatics, and there'd be a moment where the signal would drop out and wander off frequency a bit.
Sal, there's a lot of fire coming from the right side of that deflection tower.
I'm on it.
I'm going in.
I suppose the idea must have come from war movies and actual documentary sounds of helicopter fights, things in Vietnam, things the public was hearing over the years, rather than having pristine studio recordings where everything was clean and absolutely intelligible. Adding this whole dimension of transmission to the voices made it seem more natural and real and gave it a whole new dimension.
Luke, trust your feelings.
It wasn't really done as a nice, slick, clean movie. It was meant to be slightly documentarish, slightly caught offhand, and not with all the niceties of a nice, clean track or a nice, clean set. And this is, again, where being able to use World War II footage and cutting it together really helped me cut this sequence and finish this sequence before I even shot the movie. So then I could really see how all this was visually going to go together. So I was still using these old documentary films to fill in the gaps, but I could really get a very fine cut on the battle before we actually shot the special effects shots. So we only had to shoot exactly what was in the rough cut of the movie.
Several fighters have broken off from the main group. Come with me.
Watch your back.
It was quite a logistic nightmare to organize this whole sequence for us to be able to shoot all the 100 or 200 shots that go into it. We had all these cockpit shots that all needed starfields and ships flying out of the back. You know, you see all the little tiny windows back there, and just getting them all lined up so that you could sort of see them logistically was very time consuming, and then eventually composited so it all looks right. It was quite a deal. And that's probably about a third to half the shots in the sequence are these cockpit shots, but they took an awful lot of work to do them also.
But this was designed to be a very cinematic sequence, and that was one of my ways of getting past the fact that we couldn't do really high-quality shots. So instead of doing a few real high-quality shots the way Stanley Kubrick did in 2001, we did a whole bunch of kind of low-quality shots, but we made them very short so they were hard to see. And so I was hoping that by virtue of the fact that they were so short, that it would give you the impression that everything was there and that we had lots of ships and there was battle and the whole thing, looked better than it really did. Again, this was before DVDs or being able to stop a film and go back and look at it several times. And this was originally designed that you see the film once and you're blown away. But if you studied it for a while, you'd figure it out pretty quick. And that was just because I didn't really have any money to create a very high quality scene. So I kind of faked it with a lot of fast editing that was the principle behind the idea of the battle. And it would be a very frantic kind of battle, not a controlled, quiet battle.
Yes, sir.
When we were doing it, we just didn't have any idea if we were actually going to get the movie done. It was so much work we had to do, right down to January, February, March. The movie needed to be done because it was going to be in the theaters in May, and we were working right up to the very end.
Loosen up! Gold 5 to Red Leader. Lost Kyrie, lost Hutch.
I copy, Gold Leader.
It came from behind.
We've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. Should I have your ship standing by?
Evacuate? In our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances.
Rebel base 3 minutes and closing.
The countdown to the Death Star was actually an interesting thing because that is something that came out of editing. It wasn't in the script, but as we started to edit the film and everything, in order to get a stronger time lock, I came up with the idea of having the Death Star bearing down on the planet and this countdown going through the whole thing. Because originally it was just like, we're going to try to blow up the Death Star. And then it wasn't until the post-production process that it came up with the idea of if they didn't blow up the Death Star would blow up them. And that made all the difference in the world in terms of ratcheting up the drama and suspense at the end of the movie here. It came very late in the game.
Open for those fighters.
There's too much interference.
No sign of any. Wait,
I had the scenes of Parkin watching the battle, but the idea that we're clearing the moon and that, they were in range, I came up with later. The little graphs of it coming around. That it couldn't fire on them until it came around got into position. But in a way, it's the way you make movies. It's the way you write stories. It's the way you do any work of art, actually. If you do it in layers, you do it, you step back, you look at it, come up with ideas about how to make it better. You can improve it. You condense it, you move it down, you keep working with it. It's like modeling clay. It's not something where you lay out a blueprint and then you just follow it religiously and then you cut it religiously and then you release it. You need to work with the material and with the story and what you have and kind of let the movie dictate a little bit of what's going to happen in the characters. Let them sort of, sometimes you get a situation where the character just doesn't ring true saying that or doing that. And you have to say, well, what would they do in that situation? What would they say? And then that takes you on another route. It may not be the one you intended, but it is basically more believable.
One of the pleasant aspects of putting the sound together in the battle is that there are moments where it's quiet and moments where it's very loud, and they alternate back and forth, so there's a chance for the ear to rest, and it also creates a sense of depth. And you're in the cockpits, and each cockpit among the pilots has a different tonality to it. I made them all different pitches. So when you're cutting from cockpit to cockpit to cockpit, the tone goes up a little, goes down a little, and it differentiates the different pilots in their different locations and just adds once again to the dimension of the film. It's telling you that each pilot is moving at a slightly different speed and has a different attitude in his flight path. We took the approach that each cut in the picture would necessitate a change in texture of the sound, that the cockpit backgrounds would vary in pitch and level. And it was important as we went from X-Wing to Y-Wing to TIE Fighter that each one had a characteristic sound that kept you located within each ship. And then whether you were in the ship or outside the ship, things were treated differently.
You can't do any more good back there. Sorry.
Let him go. Stay on the lead.
Hurry, Luke, they're coming in much faster this time. We can't hold
When you're in the ship, there was a lot of surround. The sound of the engines are also in the back of the theater as well in the front, so the sound is as if you were in the ship itself. Then when you go outside, the sounds follow the action. If it's two ships in the distance, the sound is way in the center, just in the center speaker, and as the sound comes toward you and goes past you, the sound grows into the full stereo image and then goes into the rear speakers, for instance. So there was every attempt in this film to create space with the sound, to move sounds from one part of the theater to another. And although that's commonplace nowadays, at the time Star Wars was first mixed, it was an unusual process to do this. There really had not been very many stereo films to predate Star Wars, and it really opened the door creatively for many films to follow. And it kind of awakened the producers of films and the public as to the value that a stereo, high-quality soundtrack could have on the impact of a motion picture.
His computer's on. Luke, you switched off your targeting computer. What's wrong?
Nothing. I'm all right.
You know, looking back on Star Wars, it was quite a breakthrough film. You know, for my little field, the field of visual effects has turned into a giant industry at the moment, and I certainly never thought that at the time. None of us did. But with the advent of, motion control photography that John Dykstra introduced into this show, and incredible blue screen compositing that Richard and Edlin and guys were involved with, really opened the industry up to be able to make movies that tell stories that people hadn't really seen before and not have them look fake. It was pretty exciting. The whole baby boom generation was there and wanted to see these movies. And, here we are decades later still making them, and the effects industry has now become an industry when it used to be just an occasional little thing that, they'd make a couple of effects movies in 1 year, and then 5 years later, they'd do a couple of more effects movies. That's the way Hollywood used to work. And it was that way, like when I was growing up, I never expected there would ever be a business in this. This was always going to be, for me, Star Wars was going to be a fun project to work on, but something that could be over in a year and a half, and there'd be like nothing else. And I was probably going to get out of the business because there just was no business.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
When I read this script, I did not like science fiction movies. That is not what I liked. I read this script and really thought that he had done this extraordinary job of creating this other world. He had made characters and created a value system and all of this stuff that certainly was based in stuff that, we know and respond to. But he had done this thing and imagined this thing, especially visually, that I had never seen portrayed before in writing. And it was incredibly successful in terms of what I had read. And so I knew I would be really interested to see if he'd been able to carry it off. And I knew it was a very well-crafted script, and I knew that this guy was really talented. I mean, I'd seen American Graffiti, and for whatever else, he was somebody worth watching on that level. But this man was at that time not very verbal, but he has a very visual imagination. And he is able to sort of not be confined to what he knows or what he's been taught in this world that he invents solar systems, and he invents characters with character names that have nothing to do with, anything that you could find in any dictionary or encyclopedia or anywhere. And so he is not inhibited by any of those things. So that's someone that has this kind of odd courageousness and inventiveness that is really extraordinary.
I was, a struggling director. I'd just made my first successful film. I thought I'd sort of had my one success in life, which was American Graffiti. And so I was just going from movie to movie, and then by the time I finished this film, I never expected this was going to go anywhere. And I figured that my struggle was going to be to try to get the other two films made, somehow borrow, beg, steal the money to, go and make a movie after this one was not that successful. The first three films, I couldn't even have considered at this point in time. I mean, there's no way. This film was very carefully constructed around the technology I had available at the time. It's very, very controlled where we go. It's very limited in what we see. And decisions were made in the storytelling to say, well, I'll only go here and I'll only see this. I mean, it'd be great to do all this other stuff, but I can't. I can't do that. Like, in this particular film, well, going to see the Emperor on Coruscant was not a possibility. No way I could go there. I kind of knew what the planet was and everything, but I didn't, there is no planet. So, I had to create it. I couldn't, just physically, you can't do that. It's too big. It'd take a huge, huge miniature that would be vastly expensive. And all these films, I had limited resources, so I was just sort of saying, well, can't do that. And I was very careful not to deal with a lot of the other issues that would come up, especially fashion issues and cultural issues. Just environmental issues that I was able to say, well, I'll just do it all in a desert. That kind of looks spacey. And then I'll do a little bit in the jungle. But, I controlled my environments very carefully, and then went to the next film. I said, well, now we'll do snow. And, I pretty much used up in the course of these three movies, every bit of natural terrain that looked exotic that I could find. But to go places to other planets that were truly exotic was unthinkable. And so you just couldn't tell a story like that. Like the first three stories, the first three parts of the trilogy could never have been told using this technology. It just couldn't be done. So, you just don't think about it. You could write it as a book or something, but you'd never be a movie. And now, using digital technology, we're able, especially in terms of fantasy films, to go to places and make them realistic. That wasn't possible before. That it's something that was a literary idea. And most science fiction is literary in nature. It's perfect for a book, but it's not very good for cinema. It's very easy to create those magical worlds in language. It's very hard to create them in a realistic way on the screen and make them believable. And the one thing that digital effects have allowed us to do is to create these alternate realities in a believable fashion and tell more fantastic stories than we were able to do before, which is, great for the people that are trying to put these things into a cinematic medium.